The silence in the Damascus cell is a physical weight, a presence that presses on the ears and the mind. An Israeli pilot's capture just months earlier is a consequence of a sky that has turned hostile over the Golan Heights, a sky now filled with Soviet-made missiles. He is no longer just a pilot, he is a symbol, a piece of leverage in a war that has no front lines, only a slow, grinding tally of pain. The Six-Day War of June 1967 was a conflict that ended with a stunning military victory, but it did not bring peace. Instead, it ushered in a long, bitter, and deeply unstable era. When the fighting stopped, Israel found itself in control of territories that would become household names, their futures forever tied to the region's turbulent history, the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. This new reality created a profound paradox for the young nation. Militarily, Israel was stronger and more secure than it had ever been, with defensible borders on natural geographic features. But strategically, this new territorial dominance was paired with a state of permanent and simmering insecurity. None of Israel's neighbors accepted the outcome of the war as final. In the capitals of Cairo, Damascus, and Amman, the overwhelming sentiment was not one of reconciliation, but of revenge. The loss was not just a matter of territory, it was a deep wound to national prestige, a humiliation that undermined regimes and stirred a potent sense of unrest across the entire Arab world. By the late 1960s, this tense and unwinnable peace had slipped into a new kind of conflict, a form of warfare that would come to be known as the War of Attrition. It was a grinding, low-intensity and seemingly endless struggle marked by daily artillery duels across ceasefire lines, daring nighttime commando raids, guerrilla attacks and constant bloody friction along the borders. Nowhere was this tension more visible or more personal than along the newly established front between Israel and Syria. Throughout the early 1970s, the Israeli Air Force maintained a state of near-constant operations over the Golan Heights and into Syrian territory. These were not missions of conquest, but of vigilance and retaliation. Reconnaissance flights, flying high and fast, monitored Syrian troop movements and the construction of new military installations. Attack missions would periodically strike Syrian artillery batteries that were shelling Israeli positions or the radar sites that guided them. But Syria was not alone in this fight. With extensive and unwavering support from the Soviet Union, Damascus had begun to construct one of the densest and most sophisticated air defense networks in the entire region. Soviet advisors arrived to train Syrian crews in the use of this new hardware, and most ominously for the Israeli pilots, advanced surface-to-air missile systems, particularly the formidable SA-2, began to change the fundamental balance of power in the skies. The Israeli pilots, who for years had flown with a sense of near invincibility, now faced a lethal and ever-present danger. The sky, once their domain, was turning hostile. During a series of intense aerial engagements over the Golan, this new reality was driven home in the most brutal way possible. 3 Israeli aircraft were hit by Syrian defenses. Their pilots, following their training, ejected from their crippled jets and parachuted down toward the contested territory below. They were captured by Syrian ground forces almost immediately. Their names would become a national cause in Israel: Gideon Magan, Pini Nachmani, and Boaz Aitan. Within hours of their capture, they were transported to the Syrian capital of Damascus and disappeared into the shadows of the state's security apparatus. For Israel, the loss of 3 pilots was a devastating blow that resonated far beyond its tactical significance. Israeli military culture places an exceptional and almost sacred value on its air crews. The pilots of the Israeli Air Force represent years of grueling selective training. They are an enormous financial investment. They hold an elite status within the nation's society, But beyond that, they are a powerful symbol of national confidence and technological superiority. Now 3 of them were prisoners. The Syrian media quickly publicized their capture, parading the dazed and injured pilots on television as trophies of their nation's resistance. But after the initial headlines faded, a chilling and impenetrable silence followed. Israel had no direct access to their condition, no information on their whereabouts. The international humanitarian organizations that would normally monitor the treatment of prisoners of war were denied access. Reports, trickling in through intelligence channels, suggested the pilots were enduring harsh interrogations and brutal conditions in notorious Syrian jails. They were not being treated as conventional prisoners of war. They were strategic assets, valuable bargaining chips to be held in secret and exploited when it was politically convenient for the Syrian regime. Inside Israel, the pressure on the government began to mount. The families of the captured pilots demanded action. The public, connected to its small, intimate military in a way few other nations are, demanded answers. And the military leadership itself faced a moral dilemma that cut to the very core of its identity, a conflict between its strategic imperatives and its most deeply held values. Initially, Israel turned to the quiet and patient channels of diplomacy. Messages were passed through international intermediaries. Appeals were made via the Red Cross and the United Nations. Quiet, back-channel proposals for a prisoner exchange were floated. All of them failed. The government in Damascus remained defiant and unmoving. Syria refused to negotiate publicly, and it rejected all private overtures. The pilots were leverage, and Syria intended to extract the maximum possible political value from them. Months passed. The silence from Damascus continued. Inside Israel's leadership, patience gave way to a growing sense of urgency. A deeply ingrained principle, a foundational pillar of the Israeli military ethos, began to dominate every secret discussion. We do not leave our soldiers behind. This was not mere rhetoric, it was doctrine. It was a sacred promise. But the options were severely limited. Rescuing the pilots directly through a daring raid deep inside Syrian territory was deemed impossible. Such an act would almost certainly trigger a full-scale war. And so, with the path of diplomacy blocked and the path of direct action closed, a different, far more audacious idea began to emerge from the shadows. As the diplomatic channels grew colder and the silence from Damascus stretched into an agonizing impasse, the leadership in Jerusalem came to a stark and unavoidable conclusion. The conventional tools of statecraft, negotiation, international pressure, and quiet diplomacy had all failed. If Syria would not willingly come to the negotiating table, then Israel would have to find a way to force them there. A new and far more dangerous strategy began to emerge from the secret, high-level discussions. The concept was simple in its theory and breathtakingly dangerous in its practice. If Syria was using the captured Israeli pilots as leverage, then Israel would have to create its own countervailing leverage. It would have to capture Syrian assets of sufficient rank and value to compel Damascus to make a deal. The goal was not to inflict pain or to retaliate, but to create a situation of mutual interest, to acquire a set of bargaining chips so valuable that the Syrian regime would have no choice but to engage in a prisoner exchange. But the question was, where could such a capture be made, and who would be the targets? Raiding a military base inside Syria itself was out of the question. The Syrian heartland was a fortress protected by one of the densest air defense networks in the world and a large, well-equipped army. A direct assault would be suicidal. Attempting a similar operation on the heavily fortified Golan Heights front was also deemed far too risky. The chances of a prolonged firefight and significant casualties were too high, and the potential for a small raid to escalate into a full-blown border war was immense. The answer, the planners realized, lay not to the east, in the heart of Syria, but to the west, in the chaotic and increasingly volatile landscape of southern Lebanon. At that time, in the early 1970s, Lebanon was a fragmented and politically weak state. Its central government had little to no real control over large parts of the country, particularly in the south. This power vacuum had been eagerly filled by a variety of armed Palestinian factions who used the area as a base for launching guerrilla attacks against northern Israel, and operating freely among them with the tacit approval of the Lebanese government were significant numbers of Syrian military forces. Syrian officers moved throughout southern Lebanon with a sense of impunity, coordinating with their local Palestinian allies, supervising training camps and manning observation posts near the Israeli border. For them, Lebanon was a safe rear area, a place where they could operate without fear of a direct Israeli military response. They felt safe. And that sense of safety, the Israeli planners realized, was their greatest vulnerability. The mission, however, could not be entrusted to just any military unit. This was not a conventional infantry assault or a tank battle. It required a unique and highly specialized set of skills. It demanded absolute precision, a deep integration with the intelligence services, an unwavering discipline, and a keen political awareness of the potential for unintended consequences. It demanded a unit of soldiers who could strike with the speed and lethality of a viper and then disappear back into the shadows without leaving so much as a fingerprint. The task, inevitably, fell to Sayeret Matkal. At the time, Sayeret Matkal was, and remains, Israel's most elite and secretive reconnaissance and special operations unit. Modelled after the British Special Air Service, SAS, its primary roles were deep penetration intelligence gathering, counter-terrorism, and hostage rescue. Its operators were drawn from the best and brightest of the Israeli military, men who were not just physically tough but also highly intelligent, creative, and capable of operating with a high degree of autonomy deep behind enemy lines. Among its rising young officers at the time was a man named Ehud Barak, a brilliant and fiercely ambitious commander who would go on to lead the unit, become the chief of staff of the entire Israeli Defense Forces, and eventually the Prime Minister of Israel. The operation was given its code name, Crate. The objective was simple, stark, and utterly unambiguous. It was not to destroy, it was to capture. The mission was to infiltrate southern Lebanon, to ambush a convoy of high-ranking Syrian officers, and to bring them back to Israel alive. These men would become the key, the leverage, the price that would be demanded for the safe return of the 3 Israeli pilots who were languishing in the prisons of Damascus. The unconventional answer had been found. Now, the immensely difficult and dangerous work of turning that answer into a reality could begin. With the audacious concept approved and the elite soldiers of Sayeret Matkal assigned to the task, the mission entered a long and painstaking period of preparation. For months, the entire Israeli intelligence apparatus focused with an obsessive, laser-like intensity on one single, overriding question. How do Syrian officers move in southern Lebanon? The success or failure of Operation Crate would depend not on brute force, but on the quality and the granularity of the intelligence. The answers came not from high-tech satellite imagery or electronic intercepts, but from the oldest and most patient form of intelligence gathering, human sources. A vast and complex network of assets was activated. Israeli case officers working under deep cover met with informants in clandestine locations. The information they gathered was often fragmentary, seemingly insignificant, but when pieced together it began to form a coherent picture. Gas station attendants, going about their daily work, were tasked with memorizing the license plates of the military vehicles that passed through their stations. Shepherds, who spent their days wandering the remote hillsides with their flocks, became the unwitting and sometimes witting observers of Syrian convoy movements. And most importantly, covert Israeli observation teams Small units of soldiers who were secretly inserted into southern Lebanon would hide for weeks at a time on remote mountain slopes, their powerful binoculars and cameras trained on the roads below. Slowly, meticulously, patterns began to emerge from this sea of raw data. The analysts in Tel Aviv discovered that certain high-ranking Syrian officers traveled on a regular, predictable basis along specific roads. Timetables began to form. They learned which days of the week the convoys ran, the approximate times they passed certain checkpoints, and the typical composition of the vehicles. They noted the points where the convoys would slow down at predictable, winding bends in the road. One location in particular stood out. It was a narrow hairpin curve on a remote road in the Mount Dov region, an area also known as the Shabar Farms. The geography of this specific spot was perfect for an ambush. The road was hemmed in by steep, rocky terrain on both sides, making any escape difficult. And the sharpness of the curve forced all vehicles, no matter their size, to reduce their speed to a crawl. This, the planners decided, would be the kill zone. With the location chosen, the men of Sayeret Matkal began to rehearse the operation with a relentless, perfectionist zeal. At their secret training base, a full-scale terrain model of the ambush site was constructed, every rock, every bush, every contour of the road replicated with painstaking accuracy. They rehearsed every single phase of the operation over and over again. They practiced shooting out the tires and the engine blocks of moving vehicles without killing the occupants, a feat of marksmanship that required an incredible degree of skill and restraint. They drilled on how to force the doors of a vehicle open in a matter of seconds, how to drag the occupants out, and how to subdue and restrain them with a swift, brutal, and non-lethal efficiency. They practiced the use of plastic handcuffs and blindfolds, the techniques for moving their prisoners quickly and quietly to the extraction vehicles. They also rehearsed the crucial supporting elements of the ambush. Teams were designated to block the road at both ends of the kill zone to prevent any other vehicles from entering or escaping the trap. They developed contingency plans for how to handle the unexpected appearance of civilians, of shepherds with their flocks, or of a random Lebanese army patrol. Even the withdrawal was planned with a criminal's attention to detail. The team would not use military jeeps, which would be instantly recognizable. Instead, they selected a number of ordinary civilian rental cars. There would be no military markings, no traceable documents. To any casual observer, they would look like a group of ordinary Lebanese men going about their business. Every man knew his role with an absolute instinctive certainty. Every movement, every command, every possible contingency was drilled and re-drilled until it became pure, unthinking muscle memory. The anatomy of the ambush was complete. All that was left was to find the right moment to strike. With the meticulous planning and the grueling rehearsals complete, the soldiers of Sayeret Matkal were ready. They were a finely tuned instrument of war, honed to a razor's edge, waiting for the signal to strike. But the real world of special operations is a place of immense friction, a world where the perfect plan often collides with the messy, unpredictable nature of reality. The path to Operation Crate the Three would be paved with frustration, with aborted missions, and with a growing sense of doubt. The first attempt, codenamed Crate 1, was launched in early June of 1972. The intelligence was solid. A convoy carrying a high-ranking Syrian officer was scheduled to travel along the designated route at a specific time. Under the cover of a moonless night, the Sayeret Matkal team deployed perfectly. They crossed the border into Lebanon on foot, moving like ghosts through the mountainous terrain. They reached the ambush site, and every man took up his pre-arranged position. The roadblocks were in place, the assault team was hidden, the trap was set. They waited in the silent darkness, the tension a palpable, living thing. Then, just as the convoy was reported to be imminent, a new and unexpected order came crackling over the radio from the operations command post back in Israel. The message was two gut-wrenching words: abort, withdraw. No explanation was given. The men on the ground were left to speculate. Had the intelligence been wrong? Had the convoy been cancelled? Had they been detected? A hot, burning wave of frustration washed over the team, but their discipline, the core of their very being, prevailed. Without a word of complaint, they packed up their gear, erased all traces of their presence, and began the long, silent trek back to the border. Days later, they would learn the reason for the abort. The intelligence had been good, but at the last minute it had changed. The high-ranking officer they were targeting had altered his travel plans. To proceed with the ambush would have been to capture a group of junior officers, a prize that was not valuable enough to justify the immense risks of the operation. Days turned into weeks, and the intelligence network worked feverishly to find a new opportunity. A new date was set, a new target was identified. The second attempt, Crate 2, was launched. This time, everything seemed to be aligned. The team once again deployed flawlessly. They reached the ambush site and set their trap. And this time, the target convoy arrived, exactly as predicted. The headlights of the lead vehicle appeared around the bend. The men tensed, their fingers resting on the triggers of their weapons, their hearts pounding. The moment of action was just seconds away, and then fate intervened. At the precise moment that the Syrian convoy was entering the kill zone, another vehicle, a Lebanese army armored car, appeared unexpectedly from the opposite direction. It was possibly carrying a senior Lebanese official. At the same time, a local shepherd, who had not been there moments before, wandered dangerously close to the ambush site with his flock of goats, his silhouette stark against the rising moon. The political risk of the operation exploded in an instant. A firefight involving a Lebanese army vehicle, or the accidental killing of a civilian shepherd, would create a massive international incident. It would turn a covert, deniable operation into a public and diplomatic catastrophe for Israel. Again, the agonizing order came down from headquarters. Abort! Abort! Twice they had come to the very brink of success, and twice they had been forced to pull back. The two failures took a heavy toll on the morale of the unit. The men, who had been wound as tight as a watch spring, now had to grapple with a corrosive sense of anticlimax and doubt. But the lessons learned from these aborted missions were invaluable. The commanders realized they needed a more flexible plan, one that could adapt to the sudden, unexpected appearance of third parties. The intelligence analysts refined their methods, working to get an even clearer and more real-time picture of the operational environment. The frustration was immense, but it did not break their resolve. It hardened it. They would try again. On the third attempt, they knew everything would have to be perfect. The stakes were now higher than ever. The pressure to succeed, to finally bring home the prize that would free their captive pilots, was immense. The ghost would walk one more time. On the third attempt, everything aligned. The intelligence was triple-checked and confirmed. The weather was perfect. The political will was firm. Operation Crate 3 was a go. Under the deep, star-filled blanket of a Middle Eastern night, the men of Sayeret Matkal crossed the border into Lebanon for the final time. They moved on foot, their bodies lean and hard, their movements economical and silent. They followed the winding, ghost-like mountain trails known only to a few local shepherds and smugglers, paths that did not appear on any official map. They carried the bare minimum of gear, their weapons, their ammunition, and the tools they would need for the capture. They carried no identification, no dog tags, no personal letters. If they were to be captured or killed, they would be ghosts, their presence in Lebanon, a thing that their government could and would deny. By midnight, they had reached the familiar hairpin curve in the road. They took up their positions, melting into the shadows of the rocks and the sparse, thorny bushes. The long, tense hours of waiting began. The only sounds were the gentle whisper of the wind through the rocks and the distant, lonely cry of a jackal. Silence, a tool they had mastered through endless hours of training, ruled the night. Then in the distance, a pair of faint, yellow lights appeared. Headlights. The convoy was coming. A quiet, electric current of adrenaline passed through the team. Every man settled into his position, his breathing low and steady, his focus absolute. As the lead vehicle of the convoy, a large, dark sedan, entered the sharp bend in the road, it was met with an unexpected obstacle. A civilian car, one of the Israeli team's rental cars, was suddenly parked sideways, completely blocking the narrow road. The Syrian driver hit the brakes, and the entire convoy, a handful of military jeeps and sedans, lurched to a halt behind it. For a single, frozen moment, there was only the sound of the idling engines. Then, from the darkness, a single, whispered command was spoken into a radio headset. "Fire!" A coordinated volley of shots rang out, the sharp cracks of the rifles echoing off the surrounding rocks. The shots were not aimed at the men inside the vehicles. They were aimed with a surgeon's precision at the tires and the engine blocks. The sound of hissing air and shattering metal filled the night. The vehicles, disabled and immobilized, were now trapped. The Israeli commandos surged forward from their hidden positions, moving with a speed and a ferocity that was utterly overwhelming. Doors were wrenched open. The Syrian officers inside, stunned and disoriented, were dragged out of their vehicles and slammed to the ground before they even had a chance to reach for their weapons. There were no screams, there was almost no blood. The entire, violent and brutally efficient operation was a study in controlled force. Within seconds, it was all over. 5 Syrian officers lay bound and blindfolded on the dusty road, their hands secured behind their backs with plastic cuffs. The prize that Israel so desperately needed had been secured. Among the captives were 2 lieutenant colonels and 3 majors, all of them senior figures from the Syrian military's intelligence and operations branches. The entire ambush, from the first shot to the capture of the final prisoner, had taken less than 30 seconds. It was 30 seconds of perfect, violent and silent choreography. 30 seconds that would, in the long run, change the fate of the 3 Israeli pilots who were sitting in a dark and lonely prison cell hundreds of miles away in Damascus. The trap had been sprung, and the prize was now in their hands. The ghosts had finally caught their own. As the adrenaline of the 30-second ambush began to recede, the second and equally critical phase of the operation began: the withdrawal. The commandos worked with a swift, practiced efficiency, their movements illuminated by the cold, white beams of their flashlights. The captured Syrian officers, blindfolded and silent, were quickly loaded into the waiting civilian cars. The disabled Syrian vehicles were pushed to the side of the road, and the Israeli blocking car was moved. The entire scene of the ambush was sanitized, erased from the landscape as quickly as it had appeared. One of the captured vehicles, however, stood out. It was a large black Chevrolet Impala, a luxurious and powerful American sedan that was absurdly out of place on this remote, dusty mountain road. It was the personal transport of one of the senior Syrian colonels. The original plan had been to abandon all the captured vehicles. But, in a moment of battlefield improvisation, a decision was made. The Impala, a potent symbol of their victory, would be coming with them. It would later become a legendary footnote to the story, a war trophy that came with plush leather seats and an AM radio. The small convoy of civilian cars, now carrying its secret and precious cargo, drove calmly away from the ambush site, melting back into the Lebanese night. They followed the back roads, their headlights cutting through the darkness, appearing to all the world as just another group of late-night travelers. At one point during the long drive back to the border, they needed to refuel. they pulled into a small, sleepy gas station in a Lebanese village. As the attendant was filling one of the car's tanks, a news bulletin crackled over the small transistor radio in his booth. The announcer's voice was urgent. "Unconfirmed reports are coming in from southern Lebanon. Israeli forces have reportedly crossed the border and have kidnapped a number of senior Syrian officers." The gas station attendant froze. He dropped the fuel nozzle, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. The Israeli commandos in the car exchanged a quick, silent glance. One of them calmly got out, paid the stunned attendant for the gas, and the convoy drove on, leaving the man standing alone in the circle of light from his small station. By the first light of dawn, the entire team, along with their 5 prisoners and the captured Impala, were safely back across the border, home on Israeli soil. The operation had been a flawless success. The political shockwaves from the raid erupted almost immediately. The Lebanese government, embarrassed and furious that such an audacious raid had taken place on its sovereign territory, filed a formal complaint at the United Nations, accusing Israel of a blatant act of aggression. The Syrian government raged, its official statements filled with threats of retaliation and vows of revenge. The Soviet Union, the patron of the Syrian regime, issued its own stern condemnations. Israel, for its part, said very little. The government maintained a deliberate and frustrating ambiguity, neither officially confirming nor denying its involvement. This was the classic posture of a nation that had just conducted a successful covert operation. The silence itself was a message. Behind the closed doors of a secure Israeli intelligence facility, the interrogations of the 5 captured Syrian officers began. These were not brutal or coercive sessions. They were professional, psychological contests, as Israeli intelligence officers worked to extract every possible piece of valuable information from their high-ranking prisoners. Documents, maps, and codebooks that had been found in the captured vehicles were meticulously analyzed. A wealth of new intelligence on Syrian military operations, on their command structure, and on their cooperation with Palestinian factions in Lebanon was being harvested. But the primary value of the captured officers was not the intelligence they could provide. They were, and had always been, bargaining chips. And now, with these 5 high-value chips in their hands, the long, slow, and incredibly delicate process of a new kind of negotiation could finally begin. The silent back-channel messages began to flow once more between Jerusalem and Damascus, but this time the dynamic had been fundamentally and decisively altered. Israel was no longer just a supplicant pleading for the return of its men. It was now a player holding a powerful and winning hand. The capture of the 5 Syrian intelligence officers did not lead to an immediate breakthrough. The negotiations that followed were long, indirect, and painfully delicate. For months, the 2 sides communicated through a complex and shadowy network of international intermediaries, each one unwilling to give the other the satisfaction of a direct concession. The Syrian government, while privately desperate to secure the return of its high-ranking officers, could not afford to be seen publicly as caving to Israeli pressure. Pride, politics, and the intricate dance of Arab world prestige were all at stake. But the fundamental reality of the situation had been irrevocably changed. The leverage that Syria had once held so tightly, in the form of the 3 captive Israeli pilots, had now been neutralized. The game was no longer a one-sided affair. It had become a grim but balanced equation of pain. Slowly, painstakingly, over the course of nearly a year, the outlines of a deal began to take shape. An agreement was finally reached, brokered by the International Red Cross. On June 3, 1973, almost a full year after the audacious raid of Operation Crate 3, the exchange took place. The 3 Israeli pilots, Gideon Magen, Pini Nachmani, and Boaz Eitan, were flown from Damascus to a neutral location. After years of brutal imprisonment, of silence, of uncertainty, they were finally coming home. In exchange, Israel released the 5 Syrian officers who had been captured during the raid, along with 41 other Syrian prisoners of war who had been captured in various border skirmishes. For the 3 pilots and their families, it was a moment of profound and overwhelming emotion. For the nation of Israel, it was a moment of quiet, collective relief and vindication. The mission's ultimate purpose, the one that had been conceived in the secret meetings and forged in the crucible of the desert training, had been fulfilled. The debt had been repaid. Operation Crate 3 was not a battle in the conventional sense. There were no massive explosions, no dramatic airstrikes, no banner headlines in the newspapers, at least not at first. But it proved something powerful and enduring about the nature of modern warfare, that in the complex, asymmetrical conflicts of the modern era, a handful of highly trained and disciplined men operating in the dark can change the course of history. It proved that sometimes the loudest and most effective statements are made in complete and utter silence. The legacy of the operation resonated for years within the closed and secretive world of special operations. It became a textbook example of how to create and exploit leverage, of how a small, tactical action can be used to achieve a major strategic and political objective. It was a mission that required a perfect and seamless fusion of different elements: the patient, granular precision of the intelligence services, the skill and courage of an elite ground force, the advanced capabilities of the aviation units, the specialized expertise of the technicians, and above all, the bold, imaginative, and risk-tolerant decision-making of the high command. It was a testament to the willingness to attempt the unthinkable, to find an unconventional answer to a problem that seemed to have no conventional solution. And it was a powerful reaffirmation of the central, almost sacred tenet of the Israeli military ethos: we do not leave our soldiers behind. The raid was a physical embodiment of that promise, a declaration that the state would go to any lengths, would take any risk to bring its captured sons home. Today, the story of Operation Crate 3 remains a quiet but powerful chapter in the long and often bloody history of the Middle East. It is a reminder that the great currents of history are not always shaped by the grand, sweeping movements of armies, but sometimes by the small, silent footsteps of a few determined men in the dark.